ॐ पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षगं शान्तिर्द्यौ शान्तिर्दिशः शान्तिरवान्तरदिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर्वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिश्चन्द्रमा शान्तिर्नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिः रोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौ शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे अस्तु शान्तिः. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha. सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग् भवेत्. सर्वस्तरतु दुर्गाणि सर्वो भद्राणि पश्यतु. सर्वसद्बुद्धिमाप्नोतु सर्वत्र नन्दतु. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, the anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asato Ma Satkamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayethi Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Last week we saw how Krishna says that there are two distinct ways in which people worship the divine or approach the spiritual ideal. One is to approach it in very personal terms, to see the ideal, to see the divine, to see God in a personal way. Now, when we say in a personal way, by that is meant seeing the divine as a person. And usually, what are associated with personhood are a form, in Sanskrit it's called akara, and qualities, attributes, called guna. And therefore, a spiritual ideal that is seen in some form is called sakara. Sa akara means with form, and sa guna with qualities. Qualities such as God being seen as loving, kind, just. Now, a form is not always necessary for the divine ideal to be personal. There are traditions which see the divine with qualities, with attributes, but not necessarily with form. Because we know, even if we enter a room which is dark, you're not seeing anything, you're not seeing any forms. But you know there is someone there if you hear the person's voice, or if you can feel the presence of a person in that room, and you know that that person is loving and kind. So it's possible to feel the presence of someone even without seeing them in a specific form. Even just intuiting their presence in some way still gives us an idea that there is a person there, even if we are not seeing the form. So God, therefore, when worshipped in a personal way, is sometimes seen with form and with qualities, or sometimes with simply qualities. But there's also another ideal, another way of looking upon the divine, and that is in completely impersonal terms, when the ideal has no specific form and is beyond all qualities. And what Krishna says, and which we saw last week, was both of these methods, both of these ways, approaching God in a personal way or an impersonal way, both of these are effective. Ultimately, both of these will bring us to that same reality. But he does say that those who approach God in an impersonal way have a little bit more difficulty, while those who approach God in a personal way, it's a little bit easier for them. And we also saw why it is easier. The reason it is easy because at present, our understanding of ourselves is as a person. Every one of us knows I'm a person. And because I'm a person myself, I'm able to relate with other people as persons. So even when I try to think of God, it is easier for me to think of God as a person because I'm a person. Approaching a spiritual ideal in impersonal terms will become progressively easier for me when my own hold of my own personality, my own personhood begins to loosen up. So when I start becoming more impersonal myself, now what does it mean, being more impersonal? It means that my identification with my own physical form, with my own qualities, with my own characteristics is not so strong. Then it becomes easier for me to approach an ideal which is also not connected with the form and qualities. The difficulty comes when we want to think of the divine in impersonal way, but we still want to cling to our own form and qualities. And that's why it doesn't work. That's why then it just remains as an intellectual idea. It just remains as a cerebral thing. So there are people who sometimes speak about non-duality, speaks about the whole transcendent being, and it's very intellectually stimulating for them. It brings them joy to think of the divine in that way. But we also have to ask at the end of the day, has it changed me in some way? Am I just talking eloquently about the divine, but nothing really has changed here? Because there is no real connection established between the personal me and the impersonal ideal that I am trying to reach. Now, we have also seen that the personal ideal and impersonal ideal are not two different ideals. That the ideal is one. It's just that in my present state of being, it is easier for me to see that one ideal in personal terms. Well, to someone else, it might be easier to see the same ideal in impersonal terms. The ideal itself is neither personal nor impersonal. The ideal transcends both. The concept of person and the concept of the impersonal, both are transcended into the ideal. So we have the freedom to go by either way, and ultimately we reach the same goal. This is what we saw last time. Now, whichever of these paths we choose, and that was another question, was whether we choose it or it gets chosen for us. In a natural sort of way, we are attracted to a certain ideal, and that's not always intellectually determined. And therefore, it's good to have that spontaneity in our spiritual life. Sometimes it can happen, and it does happen sometimes, when people are attracted to a devotional approach to the divine. The approach filled with love, with adoration, that we are attracted to so a personal form. And yet, someone may have put an idea into our head that, oh, the path of non-duality is higher, it's somehow better, it's somehow superior. And so then it creates a conflict. My heart longs for one thing, and intellectually I just feel, let me go by that something which is higher and superior. So what Krishna is saying here is, no need to have that conflict. Just follow your heart. The best path in spiritual life is the path of least resistance. So follow your heart. See if you feel attracted to a certain ideal in a certain way, go by that way. Because ultimately, as we also saw, the journey is not towards form or to the impersonal. It's beyond even the idea of personal and impersonal. And we always go, the prayer that we do at the beginning of every time we meet, Asatoma Satgamaya, Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya, it all means that the journey is always from that which is tangible, that which is our present experience, to something that is beyond. So it's from the tangible to the intangible, from the form to the formless, and beyond those form and formlessness. The journey is from sound, which is the sound of your mantra, to beyond sound. That's how spiritual life progresses. Now, whichever of these ways becomes our own way in spiritual life, what we all need is clarity. The example that often comes to mind is when we are driving, and if the windshield is very cloudy, it become foggy, then my car may be in perfect condition. I may be a very good driver, but if my windshield is foggy, then I won't be able to see where it is going, and the chances of an accident become more. So that is what can happen in our life as well. We may be physically and mentally fit. We may be raring to march ahead in spiritual life, but the windshield is foggy. And the windshield really is the lens through which I look at life, the lens through which I understand life. So we need to clear that mental fogginess. And in that context, I had said that the Gayatri prayer is very helpful, because it is that which clears the fogginess of the mind. It is that which gives my mind clarity, so I can see clearly. I can make intelligent choices. I can take good decisions, the kind of decisions, the kind of choices that I will not have to regret later on. And so one of you had requested last week that we discuss a little bit about the Gayatri prayer. So let me do that now. It is said that in the Vedic system of education, when the student first approached the teacher, and usually it happened with a small ceremony. Sometimes in Sanskrit, they call it Vidyarambha. Vidya is knowledge, Arambha is a beginning. So beginning of knowledge. It's almost like the first day at school, if you like. But in the Vedic period, there weren't the schools that time the way we understand the word today. In those days, the young student had to go and approach a teacher and request to be accepted as a student. And then on, the student became a member of the teacher's household and stayed there for a number of years. Almost like a son or daughter of that teacher, carrying out all the household chores and also being taught. So that's why the teacher-student relationship is often seen as a parent and a child relationship, because a teacher is one's parent, a spiritual parent. And so the first thing we read in books, that the first lesson that the teacher gave the student was this Gayatri prayer. Even before formally beginning the study of the Vedas, the first thing the student was told, come here, and here is this prayer. And the prayer, as many of you may be aware, it's simple. It's a little bit long, longer than a conventional mantra, which tend to be generally smaller. So this prayer goes like this. Om Bhur Bhuvaswaha Tat Savitur Varenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yonah Prachodayat. Translated, it means like this. Om, we meditate upon the worshipful effulgence of the divine sun. The sun is here a symbol, because that's the most shining, the brightest object known to us on this planet. Although we know now that in the larger scheme of things, the sun is a pretty minor star really in our galaxy. It's not even the brightest and the biggest star. But to us, from where we are located, the sun is the most shining object that is known to us. And so sun here is a symbol for that effulgent being, that supreme reality. So we meditate upon the worshipful effulgence of that supreme reality, symbolized by the sun, who pervades the earth, sky, and heaven. So these are the three worlds that are often referred to: the earth, where we are, uh, the sky, and heaven. The sky is sometimes just seen as the, the, the realm of the departed spirits. That is somehow sometimes interpreted that way. And heaven is where all these celestial beings live. So may that reality guide our understanding. So to quickly go word by word, Bhuhu, Om Bhur Bhuvaswaha, that's how the prayer begins. Bhuhu, Bhu means the earth. Bhuvaha, Bhuvaha means technically the space between the earth and the heaven. Higher than the earth, a little below the heaven. If higher and lower makes sense in the infinite space. And so this intermediate realm is sometimes seen as the realm of the spirits, where the departed spirits go. And then Swaha means heaven, a little higher world where the celestial beings and all the higher powers, often embodied beings we read about. For instance, in the Vedic period, we had Indra, Varuna, and all these Vedic deities were mentioned as dwellers in that realm. And then, of course, now there are many other deities that got introduced in a later period, when we see in the period of the Puranas and the epics. So it's possible to see that realm as filled with these celestial beings. Tat means that. Savituhu Devasya, of that divine sun. Varenyam, Varenyam means worthy of worship. Bhargaha, Bhargaha means effulgence. Bhargo, now that Bhargaha, by the rules of Sanskrit grammar, that Visarga, Bhargaha become Bhargo. So Bhargo means effulgence. Dhimahi, Dhimahi means we meditate on. It's interesting that it's in the plural. Although it's possible to chant this prayer alone by oneself, it seems as if this was the prayer done by a group of students in the teacher's home. So we meditate upon. So Dhimahi means we meditate upon. Then Yaha means who. Naha means our. Dhiyaha, understanding. Again, this is in the plural because there are a number of students doing. Because the singular will be dhi. The plural will be dhiyaha, our understanding. So the intellects of all of us. Prachodayat means please direct it, guide it. And so put together, if you just kind of rearrange the words of the prayer in a prose order, it would be Bhuvaha, Bhuhu, Bhuvaha, Swaha, Tat Savituhu Devasya, Varenyam Bhargaha, Dhimahi, Yaha Dhiyaha Prachodayat, Yaha Naha Dhiyaha Prachodayat. So let me read the translation again. We meditate upon the worshipful effulgence of the divine sun, that is the supreme reality, who pervades the earth, sky, and heaven. May that reality guide our understanding. In practical terms, as a student repeats this prayer, the student visualizes in the heart is filled with light, the light of consciousness. And as I said, the brightest light known to us is the light of the sun. So, but the light here is not the physical light, it's the light of consciousness. So we meditate on that bright light filling the heart as we repeat this prayer, and then pray that that light may guide our understanding. We have the power of the intellect, but unless that power is directed in an intelligent way, in the right direction, that power can get dissipated, that power can get wasted. And so this is the prayer that, first of all, let my dhi. Now, I need to say a little bit about dhi. The word that comes often in the Gita is buddhi. And dhi also comes in the Gita, but buddhi is a word that comes more often. Now, buddhi is often translated as the intellect. Now, dhi also means the intellect, but sometimes the two are distinguished because dhi is the word that gets used in Gayatri. That what is the difference, if there is a difference at all, between buddhi and dhi? As I said, both refer to the intellect. But generally, by convention, buddhi in common discourse often refers to the intellect that we already have. And as a form of distinction, then dhi becomes a higher form of buddhi. A higher form is meant a buddhi that has opened up. Now, what does opening up mean? Think about okay, think about this. Sometimes, when now there are apps that are available on the App Store, for example, if you're using an Apple device, to give one example, there are lots of apps available, and you can download pretty much any app. And there are many apps which can be downloaded for free, and so you download them, and you can start using them right away. And then, among many of these freely downloaded apps, eventually you will get a message saying, well, there are a lot more things you can do with this app. And usually what they'll ask is you have to pay something for it. So there is a paid version embedded in that downloaded app, which can do a lot more things. Sometimes they just call it a pro version. And so you pay something, and then that same app then is able to do a lot more. Now, I know this is a rather crude example, but it's a little bit like that. So think about it. Think about it this way. So God has given us this free app, the Buddhi, freely downloadable. We were born with it, right? But all the potentialities in these buddhis are still locked. And we must pay for it in order to unlock or in order to open up the full potentialities in this buddhi. Now, how do we pay? We pay through discipline, through a self-disciplined life, a life which is guided by principles, a life that is guided by some values. So a person who follows, and oftentimes these are mentioned in the Yoga Sutras, you have these preliminary yama, niyama, the rules of moral conduct, the rules of the inner control, the control of the mind, the control of the senses. In Vedantic books, it is spoken of in terms of shama and dhamma. Shama is often seen as restraining the mind. Dhamma is seen as restraining the senses. Now, all these are the kind of a payment, if you like, which are necessary to unlock all the powers of buddhi. And so, dhiyo yonah prachodayat. Please guide my understanding. So this prayer is really a prayer to the divine being, a prayer to God to unlock all the parts of the buddhi. Because unless my buddhi opens up, unless all the powers of the buddhi, which is what sometimes they refer to as dhi, when that is opened up, and with that clarity, that full power of that intellect, I'm able to look at the Vedas or look at any scriptural passage. All the depth of the meaning embedded in it is revealed to me. Otherwise, our reading will be very superficial. For instance, now, most of the texts today, as we look at them, the Gita, which we are seeing, most of these texts are translated. Even if we don't know Sanskrit, we can look at the translation in a language that we know, and it'll make sense, and people find inspiration from it. But all of these scriptures have layers of meaning. Now, how deep will I understand any scripture will depend on how deep my gaze can go. And how deep my gaze can go will depend on how much my dhi has opened up. Otherwise, I can look at the book, read it, and if it's a good translation, it'll convey some meaning to me. But if my dhi is opened up, if I have a greater clarity, then I will understand. I can read not only what is on the line, but also between the lines. And which is why a repeated study of scriptures is recommended, because as I keep on getting greater and greater clarity in my mind, the deeper and deeper layers become revealed to us. So just reading the Gita just once is not enough. So we need to keep on praying, we need to keep on holding on to our inner disciplines, inner discipline in our prayer, worship, meditation, inner discipline in the work that we do, inner discipline in the duties and responsibilities that we carry out in life, the discipline that we have in our all interpersonal relationships and the way we deal with other people. So with that kind of a life which is guided by values and principles, I can keep on reading these important texts, whether it's the Gita or the Upanishads, or a book like the Gospel of Ramakrishna, or the works of Vivekananda, or the Bible, or the Quran, whichever spiritual text that we study. If I can do it with this greater clarity, then their inner meaning will be revealed to me. Now that is what the Gayatri prayer will do. So many people find it helpful to repeat the prayer. Some people do it 5 times, some people do it 10 times. Even those who do not have the Gayatri meditation as their primary spiritual practice often find it helpful at the beginning of their regular meditation practice to start the practice or start the day or find ways to incorporate this prayer into their own spiritual life. It's great to maybe some people can do it immediately after they take their shower, or some people can do it before they begin their meditation. A good times that this is done traditionally is what are called the 2 Sandhi times. Now, Sandhi means joining. And the joining really is the joining of the day and the night. So, the prayers involving the Gayatri are sometimes therefore referred to as the twilight devotions. Now, in a tropical country, that works a little better than where most of us are living, because a joining of the day and night would mean in the morning, a few minutes before sunrise and a few minutes after sunrise. So that interval just before sunrise would be the joining of the day and night, when the night is about to end and the day is about to begin. Similarly, in the evening, when the day is about to end and the night is about to begin, will be when, again, a few minutes before sunset. Now, because because in summer and in winter, our sunset and sunrise just vary quite widely. So don't worry so much about the sunrise and sunset. Don't go by the clock. But the idea is, if you can somehow find a way to repeat the prayer at least once in the morning and once in the evening, and if you can do it with some understanding of what the prayer means and faith that this prayer will help open up your own buddhi, awaken your dhi. Dhi is sometimes translated as the power of spiritual intuition, through which the spiritual ideas, these scriptural passages, will become clear to me. I will know what they are saying. And only if I know exactly what they are saying, will I know what I should do. So, a good understanding is vital for a proper practice. Because these scriptures are not like, sometimes they say that whenever you buy any new product, and nowadays, all products, they try to make it as user friendly as possible. And so if you have a little bit of understanding, you can start using it even without reading a manual, and go to the manual only if you are stuck somewhere. So repeating the Gayatri is a little bit like acquiring that clarity that you may not need to refer to the manual too often. So the practice, just doing what you need to do, will become very clear. So that's something that I thought I could share with you this morning about Gayatri, because the Gayatri does come up very often in our discussion of the Gita and the Upanishads. Please take a look at verses 6 and 7 of chapter 12. Let me read the verses to you. Ye tu sarvani karmani mai sanyasya matparaha ananye naiva yogena mam dhyayanta upasate teshamaham samuddharta mrityu samsara sagarat bhavami nachirat partha maya veshita chetasam. But those who worship me, resigning all actions in me, regarding me as the supreme goal, meditating on me with single-minded yoga, to these whose mind is set on me, verily, I become before long, O son of Pritha, the savior out of the ocean of the mortal samsara. So, irrespective of whether my present spiritual practice is directed towards a personal ideal or an impersonal ideal, Krishna says that one who does all these things will come to me. Now, the word me, I and me, they come throughout the Gita, and there's plenty of that me here in these two verses as well. And as we have seen often, that when Krishna uses the word me, he is not referring to this historical person. Krishna of history is delightful, is wonderful, is so inspiring. But the Krishna of history is no longer with us, is gone. Who is with us is a Krishna in his eternal dimension. Krishna who transcends history. Krishna who is as present now as he was 3,000 years ago. So the me here is not referring to the historical Krishna. So when you and I, when we speak about like I, now I say I am speaking with you, now this I could be referring to this person who is sitting here right in front of you. Now this person who is sitting in front of you is a person of history. This body is not going to be here all the time. After a few years, there will be somebody else here, speaking again on the Gita. But what will remain is the one who is inside this. So when Krishna says me, he is not referring to Krishna's body. He is not referring to the son of Vasudeva who was born So that's why one of the names of Krishna is Vasudeva, the son of Vasudeva. But when Krishna says me, he is referring to the Atman, the divine self. And what the Gita and the Upanishads say is that the divine self inside Krishna and the divine self inside me are not two different things. They are one and the same. So when we say there is God dwelling in my heart, it is that God, that divine self, which Krishna is referring to as me. So understood in that sense, Krishna is present in every one of us right now, right this moment. Krishna of history is gone, but the eternal Krishna is right here, right now. And that is the me that Krishna is referring to. That eternally dwelling power of consciousness, that light of consciousness. So let me read the verse again. So whenever you hear the word me, translate it into your mind as that divine being, as God dwelling in my heart. But those who worship me, those who worship the divine within, resigning all actions in me, surrendering all actions to the divine in the heart, regarding me as the supreme goal, regarding this divine as the supreme goal, meditating on me. So when we meditate in our heart, we are meditating on the presence of that eternal divine who is always present with single-minded attention. To such people whose mind is set on me, whose mind is set on that divine reality, that truth, to such people I become the savior out of the ocean of mortal samsara. Mrityu samsara sagara. That's the word in Sanskrit. Mrityu, translated as mortal, really mrityu literally means death. Samsara. The word samsara also comes very often in Vedanta texts. Literally, the word means samyak sarati, that which is constantly moving. So the word samsara literally means that which is constantly changing, that which is constantly moving. And that's the reality of everything we see around us. The world is constantly changing. The way Kenmore Square looked 20 years ago when I first came here and the way it looks now, it's quite different. But because now I see it every day, I don't know, because the changes occur very slowly. It's like parents. Parents, when you see your children, and because you see when the children are young and small and they are growing, because you're seeing them every day, you may not notice that they are growing, but they are growing every day. It's only someone, maybe a family friend or someone who visits you maybe after 5 years and who has seen the little baby and looks at the child and says, wow, you're grown so tall. But the baby was growing every day. So similarly, even in our spiritual life, we want to be growing every day. We may not notice that growth day by day, but we need to take a periodic look at our own selves to find that we are growing. So samsara means change, constant change. We know it's not just external change, it's internal change as well. We see the mind. How rare it is for the mind to remain still. Those of us who are lucky at times may find the mind becoming little still in meditation, in deep meditation. That's the time when the mind becomes still, everything comes to a halt. Time stops. So you will have noticed that the days in which you are deeply engrossed in your prayer and meditation, you lose sight of time. You might think as if only 5 minutes have passed, and you look and you find an hour is over. Now that can happen also when you fall asleep in meditation. But I'm not talking about falling asleep. I'm saying when you have a really deep meditation, when you're fully alert, the mind focused on your Ishta, then an entire hour can go by and you might feel as if you have just started. But most of the time, other than those few fortunate occasions when the mind becomes still, other than that, the mind is jumping all the time. It's probably even people who are not so active physically, their mind can be pretty active. So, except that because the mind is not being trained to do its activities in a disciplined way, the ability of the mind just get dissipated. But if the mind is trained, if the mind is disciplined, then this mind can do wonders. I mean, all of our thinking occurs through the mind. And just imagine if the mind is well disciplined and well trained and has acquired the clarity through Gayatri, that mind is unstoppable. There is nothing that this mind cannot do. But until that stage is reached, the mind is constantly changing. There are ideas, there are thoughts, there are hopes, there is fear, there is anxiety, there are worries. So it just boom, 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 it's just going. And doesn't stop even when we go to sleep. I mean, even when we are dreaming, the mind is very active. Dreamed is nothing but the activity of the mind. Maybe when we are in deep sleep, even then the mind is not fully at rest because the deep sleep is not equivalent to a deep meditation. In deep sleep, the mind is still vibrating, but maybe very little. The only vibration there, the only movement there is what sometimes in yoga they call it the avidya vritti. The thought wave is of ignorance. And that's why when we are fast asleep, we don't know anything. But the mind is, we could say, short of samadhi or short of a really deep meditation, the only real rest we get is in deep sleep. Other than that, the mind is constantly changing. So think about this way, the samsara, that which is constantly changing, there is change out in the external world, there is changes occurring in our body all the time, there is activity in the body, there is activity in the mind. And this never seems to stop. Now this samsara is called here as mrityu samsara. That all this change, where is it ultimately taking me? It's taking me towards death. Every entity that is created will one day be destroyed. Every product that is composed of materials, so every product is a kind of a composition, and everything that is composed will at some point in future decompose. The particles that were brought together to form a product will go away. And the more the moving parts there are, the more the separate parts there are, the greater is the probability of something going wrong and the parts coming apart. And therefore, if you buy any product in this thing, try to get a product that has as fewer moving parts as possible. The chances are it will last a little bit longer. Our body has lots and lots of moving parts. So ultimately, it's all going towards death. Sometimes people think of death as an event, death as something that happens. And of course, none of us knows when it is going to happen. But as adults, we know, although we don't want to think about it, that it is going to happen someday. But death may not be an event at all. Death may be just a completion of a process that has already started. As soon as we are born, we already start moving towards our death. As every day passes, I have gone one day closer to my death. And it becomes more worrisome also, because I don't even know which day is going to be the last day. So, seeing death not as some random, unexpected event, it might sometimes be helpful to see it as a process that starts immediately after birth. And every step we take, every day that passes, takes us closer to death. Think about the implications of this way of thinking. How careful we have to be of every decision we take in life. How careful we have to be about how we choose to spend the time, because every minute we are coming closer to an inevitable reality of death. It is like, think about it this way. If someone were to give me some fixed amount of money and say, this is all that you're going to get. You're not going to get a penny from me more. You have to live the rest of your life with this amount that you have. And since none of us knows how long we are going to live, now of course, I'm not talking about like if you're given like $1 billion and says, well, I'm not going to give anything more. You can say, well, how long do human beings live anyway? So I can then afford to be, but there are some people who manage to fritter away even that amount. But one can then probably say, knowing that I'm not going to live, give and take a few years here and there, more than 100 years, I can then at least budget something. But if I'm given a rather meager amount and says, you have to use it and you are not going to get anything more, and there is no other way you are going to get any more penny or any more money from anyone, anywhere, no matter what you do, this is all that you have, then I'm going to be very careful. Because otherwise, how will I live? Now, we can understand a little bit about this when you think in terms of money, but time is money. And every day, a little bit of my time, money, is being wasted. Now, if I can use that time to do something worthwhile, to somehow give me the ability to face death bravely, courageously, without being afraid of it, then I could say I've used that time well. Because if I don't do that, then I will suddenly come to that end of the process and find I'm completely helpless. I'm totally unprepared for it. And that's why here it says Mrityu Samsara, the samsara, this constantly changing universe, ultimately taking me towards death. Sagara, the ocean. So Mrityu Samsara Sagara. Now, you'll always find that a lot of times this analogy of an ocean is given, because it may be possible with some difficulty to go across a river if there is a small obstacle in the path. But going across the ocean, and you don't have anything, you don't have any, not even a boat to go across, and then here is this big ocean, how are you going to cross it? And so it just seems almost an impossible thing to do. The impossibility is also sometimes expressed through using samsara as a circle. So sometimes the book says samsara sagara, the ocean of samsara. Sometimes they use the image of a samsara chakra, the cycle of samsara, the circle of samsara. The circle of samsara, because the circle, while it's a beautiful form, better than a square or a rectangle sometimes, because it can have all those angles. But a circle looks more beautiful to many people. But the problem with circle, is that it has no beginning and no end. You never know where the circle is beginning and where it is ending. It just goes round and round and round. And so samsara chakra, or a circle or a cycle of samsara, means also that you are in that circle and there is no getting out. You just go up and down, up and down. And that up and down process is often gets referred to in the form of rebirth. You are born, you live, you grow old, you die, you're born again, and the whole thing goes round and round and round. That's the reason this imagery is used here. But if I do all those things, let me read that verse again. For those who worship me, resigning all actions in me, if I surrender everything to the divine, regarding the divine as the supreme goal, meditating on the supreme reality or the spiritual reality with single minded attention, only then, if I use my time well, if I acquire that clarity of mind acquired through a disciplined life, I make good use of the time, then when this process of death reaches its culmination, when I'm encountering death, I'll be free. So this is true whether or not my spiritual ideal is personal or impersonal. So Krishna here gives in an amazing way, just in these two verses, 6 and 7, what any spiritual seeker, irrespective of which tradition we belong to, irrespective of whether we are worshipping a personal ideal or an impersonal ideal, there is an urgency to use our time well, to not cling to this. Clinging to the personality also means holding on to the products of the work that is done. But surrendering it at the feet of the divine means I say, nothing is mine. Neither is this form mine, nor is this skill and knowledge and the work that I do, nothing is mine. Everything is a part of this big cycle, the cosmic cycle that is going on. If I choose to identify with any part of it, I'm stuck in this cycle. But if I say, I just want to be a witness, I will see my own body and mind as also a part of this big cycle, and I will see with this clarity acquired through discipline. It's only then that I can get outside the circle. If I go along the circle, it doesn't end. What the books say is that not just this earth is on this. So when we say samsara, it's not just only this. Even when you go to a so-called heaven or hell, God forbid, wherever we go, all heavens, all hells are a part of samsara. Even the highest Brahmaloka is a part of samsara. As long as it is some loka, it is a part of samsara. The only way to get out of it is to surrender everything to the spiritual ideal, to let go of this egocentric life, the ego-centered identity. Only when I let go of this little I, the unripe I, then this big I, the ripe I, the real I, the true I will shine forth. So we will stop here right now, and then we'll take a 5-minute break. And if you have any ideas, comments, questions, feel free to share, and then we will come back and take a look at it. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Let's take a look at questions. Can you please educate us on how God's name can purify our minds, same as a powerful mantra like Gayatri? Now, all of these mantras have the power embedded in it to awaken our understanding and take us towards the highest reality. Oftentimes it is said that it is the mantras become alive, so to speak, when they are received in a proper way from a teacher. The mantras themselves are powerful, but when they are received in a systematic way, in a process that is often called a mantra diksha and mantra initiation. So what it does is it connects us. It connects us to a living spiritual tradition, and then we become inheritors of the power embedded in that mantra, because generations of people before us have repeated that mantra and have become enlightened. So by receiving the mantra in a proper way, we inherit the power that has been passed on from one generation to the next. And then it's just as inheriting something is a wonderful thing, it also then we also inherit the responsibility of then this great treasure that we receive, that we need to then use it well so that this power is preserved for the generations to come afterwards. And so, yes, so every mantra has the power to awaken us. And Gayatri is one of the mantras. The Gayatri is simultaneously also a prayer, because sometimes people wonder whether the Gayatri mantra also has to be received from a teacher. And yes, sometimes it is. Oftentimes when there is a ceremony, often called nowadays as a thread ceremony. In Sanskrit they call it Upanayana. Upa means near, Nayana means going. So Upanayana means going near. And it was as I said, the first the beginning of the Vedic education began with Gayatri. And therefore, after this small little ceremony that is done in some households, the first thing that is done is that the Gayatri is given. Now, this can be done in a ritualistic way, but it doesn't always have to be that way. So don't wait for some big ceremony to be done in order to start repeating the Gayatri mantra. It's a prayer in the Vedas, it's sacred, and everyone is welcome to use this prayer either in the original or in the translation, because it's the spirit that is most important. So pray using the Gayatri insights, using the prayer itself if you find it convenient, and everyone has the right to use it, everyone can use it, and everyone will be benefited by using it. And as I said, this doesn't have to be one's primary practice. Whichever practice we might have, the Gayatri is not in conflict with any practice. But if done in the beginning, it just helps awaken our understanding. It helps. Sometimes it's also called the Abhyaroha mantra. It's a mantra that uplifts us. It's a mantra that makes us ready. So Gayatri can be used in conjunction with whatever practice we might have. Next, what are some easy ways to measure progress in our spiritual life to ensure we are on the right path? Good question. As I said, it may not always be possible to judge our progress day by day, because sometimes the progress might be so minuscule, so small that we may not notice it. Therefore, it is helpful to do it periodically, maybe once every 6 months, or maybe once a year, maybe on the beginning, the New Year day, or your own birthday, just find some day. But it's good to think, okay, kind of a reviewing the 1 year and say, how was I a year ago, and how am I today? What things have changed in my life? Has the change been for the better or for worse? And we may not always have a very clear cut answer to that. It might seem as if, in some respects, things have improved, in some respects, they have not. But at least we'll have a kind of a scorecard of where we stand. And then that will give us that will help us decide what I should do going forward, so that next year, a year from now, when I review my life, I will have more positives and fewer negatives. And while sometimes assessing one's progress, even yearly, might not always be easy, well, you can take a longer period. In the last 5 years, how things have changed for me, or last 10 years. But it's good to periodically review one's life to make sure whether one is progressing or not. And one of the ways we can do it, it's not, I mean, sometimes people try to measure their spiritual progress by how many visions they have had. Well, it's wonderful. If you have been blessed with some spiritual experience, that's great. But having visions or having some great dreams itself may not indicate much. I think ultimately what the better markers of progress is to see, how is my daily life? Do I continue to be perturbed by the ups and downs that are occurring in the external world and in my internal world? What is my inner strength? Am I able to absorb all the unexpected things that are occurring within me? How often do I think of my own interest? How often am I willing to go and help others? How much of hatred, anger, jealousy is in my heart? Yeah, so I mean, it's nothing very complicated in some ways. Think about it this way. As spiritual seekers, ultimately, every one of us want to become enlightened. And we might visualize the state of enlightenment in our own ways. We might have our own idea about what or how a spiritually enlightened person might be. So one way of measuring would be to say, how far or how close am I from attaining that state? For instance, if I think of an enlightened being as a person who is always calm, always filled with love, always, again, you can add your adjectives that you want. And then we can look in my own life and say, now, calm, how much of calmness do I have? Now, none of us can probably say, well, I don't have any calmness at all. We might say, well, maybe from a scale to 0 to 100, maybe I could say I'm 10% calm. Or how much of hatred is still in my heart. So the negative quality should go on becoming less, and the positive quality should go on increasing. Now, unfortunately, there is no, like a thermometer measures temperature. We don't have any gadgets to measure these things. So it has to be a very subjective thing. And if it has to be very subjective assessment, because these things are not really quantifiable mechanically, we need to create some amount of distance within in order to look at our own selves objectively and be as neutral as possible. Sometimes I think people are better at judging others than in judging themselves. Because others, we can look at them objectively. Even then, our biases and prejudices do come in, but still, it's easier to see others as objects. It's not so easy to see oneself as an object. And therefore, assessing oneself is possible only if there is some amount of ego reduction. Extremely egoistic people are terrible at self assessment. But if my ego is kind of loosened up a little bit, then it might be easier for me to look at myself and score, kind of maintain a scorecard, if you like. Next, why did God give us the locked up app buddhi? If God had given us all the clarity by default, we all would have gotten realized of our true identity. True. My counter question would be, why did we even forget our true identity? So if we had not forgotten the true identity, we wouldn't have needed that app at all, locked or not. So again, I mean, this question I can understand, maybe asked, I imagine, in a kind of a half jocular way, but when we say, why did God do it to us? What is my idea of God? God is like some benign father and saying, okay, here is your app, here is your app. No, it's not like that. In fact, in Vedanta, we see that we have found ourselves already in this condition. When did this condition start? We don't know. When we realize our true identity, what are we going to think about our present identity? I think we'll just probably laugh it off as long as we remember it. And after some time, we won't even remember that we had forgotten our identity. It's a little bit like you wake up in the morning, and maybe sometimes if you had had a really vivid dream, you might remember it for a while. You say, oh, I dreamt like that. And then after some time, you forget the dream. The dream no longer remains. So it's possible that after you have become enlightened, you might just laugh at this. Oh my God, I'm this infinite being. And what an idiot I was thinking that I was this mortal human creature. You might just laugh at it. But just like as all dreams disappear and the memory of the dreams disappear, after some time you will even forget that you were ignorantly thinking things in a wrong way. Because when nothing really has changed. So all this giving a free app, etc., are kind of helpful ways to imagine the problem that has occurred. But ultimately, we are where we are. And the good thing to know is that it is possible to get out of this mess. Next question is, can you please elaborate on verse 7 also, please? What we would do is probably next time when we meet for the Gita, I will look at verse 7 once again. Okay? Next question. We often don't fear our own deaths, but the deaths of those we love. What can we do, practice to overcome that fear? Well, it's not easy. It's not so much the fear of death, I would think, but the bonds that we have with the people around us, people in our lives, and death seems to snap those bonds, and we no longer are able to relate with the people in our life the way we have been accustomed to relating so far. It's not as if people around us who die, we can no longer, they're no longer present in our life. That's not true. Because even people after death, we still, that relationship never goes. So if someone is close to their grandfather or grandmother, and a grandfather, grandmother passes away, sure, I can no more see them physically, can no more hold their hands the way I used to before. But that doesn't mean that my grandfather or grandmother have disappeared. Yes, physically, yes. But still, they are still a part of me in a very subtle way. And so, what we are terrified often is by the fact of this physical presence of people around us may come to an end. And one way of dealing with that is not that the fear or anxiety will go away, but to remain aware of the fact that people who are around us are never going to be with us all the time. Because it's samsara, everything is changing, everything is going away. So it is something inevitable. There's nothing you and I can do about it. There is something I can do. Not that I can change the fact of death from my own life or from anyone else's life. But what I can do is, as long as I am living, as long as the people around me, those who are close to me, are living, I can use that time with the people around me in the best possible way. So that later on, when the inevitable separation occurs, I will not hold any regrets. Because sometimes when people pass away, oftentimes the mind is filled with, oh, I never had a chance to say this. I never had a chance to do this. I should have done this, but now it's too late. So that kind of a regret can be minimized if I can use the time I am with my people in a good way, in a conscious way, in a productive way. It's helpful to see everyone as a flower, for instance. We know that flowers don't last forever. When they are fresh, when the flower has just bloomed, it's wonderful. It's a joy. It brings so much happiness to just look at that flower. But we know that depending on what flower it is, maybe after a day or 2 or 3 or 4, slowly the petals are going to fall away. It's going to dry up. We know it's going to happen. But if I'm aware of the fact that that's going to happen, and then I say, but as long as this flower is with me, I'm going to take good care of it. I'm going to put fresh water every day. I'm going to look at it and enjoy its fragrance, its color, its beauty. I'm going to give good company to this flower. I will smile at that flower, and maybe the flower will smile back at me. It's possible to establish that kind of connection, that kind of relationship, not merely with the living people, but even with objects around us, objects that we sometimes see as inanimate. So if we look at the people in our lives, members of our family, our friends, as flowers, then we know that, and we ourselves are flowers too. So one day the petals are going to come away. But as long as the flower is there, I'm going to take good care of it. I'm going to, just as we give fresh water and sunlight to a growing plant, we can nourish these human flowers around us by being kind to them, by being loving to them, by helping them whenever they are in need, by sharing with them whatever we would like to share. So that's the way, if we do it, then the fear of death may not disappear, but if I'm aware of the reality of life, then I will be able to deal with that separation in a better way, in a mature way, if I've used the time together in a mature way also. And last question. If one is attracted to an impersonal form of God, does worship of personal form of God still help? Everything will help if it comes from the heart. Again, worship is not some kind of a magical formula. So if I worship God in a personal form, while I'm doing the worship, if I feel the presence of the divine there, if what I do comes from my heart, then of course it will help. It is not always helpful to get to lock ourselves into saying, I just believe in the personal or I just believe in the impersonal. That is not what we learn from the insights we get from the life and teachings of Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, Swami Vivekananda, and others in the Vedanta tradition. As I said, the divine can appear as personal, can appear as impersonal. Sometimes it's our own fanatical state of mind to say, no, it's just personal. I'm not going to look at the impersonal. Or is this? No. Why not? I should feel free to, if it comes naturally to me, to think of God as personal or to think of God as impersonal. And the two are not necessarily in conflict with one another. There are days when we might feel our heart filled with devotion, and there could be days when we feel more philosophical, more rational, and that's fine. So the different paths or the different ways of understanding the divine don't have to be in conflict with one another. Some of you would have heard the story of this one man. His name was Ghantakarna. He became known as Ghantakarna. And that's because Ghanta really means a bell and Karna means a ear. So this person was said to be a devotee of Vishnu. He was a devotee of Vishnu. And so he would do all worship of Vishnu. But, devotee to Vishnu is great. But not only he loved this form of the divine that he worshipped, he just hated all other forms. He didn't want to hear about any other deities. So my deity is the only deity. And so he used to worship his divine Vishnu every day. Some of his friends and others who came to know that he was so fanatical about Vishnu that he didn't even bear to hear the name of any other deities. And they started teasing him. And you can see that. People, they'll always do that. If you find a person has some idiosyncratic ways of doing or saying, sometimes they might just become an object of ridicule or fun among the circles in which they move. So anyway, so his friends and others in the town, they knew about his fanaticism with regard to Vishnu. So what they would do is purposely go near him and chant the name of other deities. So for instance, they will say, Shiva, Om Namah Shivaya, and you'll be terrified. I don't want to hear any other names, just Vishnu. Finally, when everyone started teasing him this way, life became impossible for him, but he was determined. And so he tied in this earring, so he put two bells here. So as soon as anyone would utter the name of any other deity, he would just shake his head like this, and the bells will go tong, 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 tong. So he wouldn't have to hear even the name of other deities. Now, you can imagine, it's a story. So even Vishnu felt, oh my God, I mean, he's a good devotee, very sincere, but this level of fanaticism. And so Vishnu wanted to teach this young man that, no, God is one and God can appear in different forms. So one day, when he was worshipping Vishnu, he was with an incense. He had this incense. Think about this as an incense. So this is an incense. He's kind of going on Vishnu like this. So what Vishnu did was, as he was waving this incense before him, Vishnu changed. Nothing is impossible for the divine. So Vishnu changed his form so that half of the deity became Vishnu and the other half became Shiva. So he wanted to teach the devotee, Vishnu and Shiva are not too different. They are the same deity. But such was the fanaticism of this fellow that as he was waving the incense and he saw half of the deity is Shiva, so, the fragrance of the incense goes in through the nostrils. So one of the nostrils was of Shiva. He did not want Shiva's nostril to get the fragrance of this incense. So he kind of stuck his finger in Shiva's nostril so that entire incense will go and the benefit of that will go only to Vishnu. Now, we don't know what Vishnu had to say after that, but I still, even Vishnu would have said, oh my God, it's really an incurable disease. So we all have to be, it's kind of a funny story in some ways, but such kind of fanatical attitudes may surreptitiously enter into our lives as well, in a very subtle way. We might think of ourselves that, oh, I'm so liberal, I'm so open. But unbeknownst to us, in certain areas of life, this kind of dogmatism or fanaticism might come. And so we have to be always on the watch that our minds don't narrow down. And to keep us on the right track, the Gayatri is something that can help us in that way. When that clarity of mind will prevent even such subtle dangers, the subtle obstacles, subtle hurdles from coming and stopping my spiritual progress. So we see how important it is to have clarity, that spiritual intuition. Then life will no longer remain superficial. We'll acquire some depth in life. Sometimes we see, and you will have noticed it in your circles as well, some of the people you see, you might have noticed how superficial they are. There is no stuff there. There is no depth there. And therefore we must look in our own heart and say, I hope I'm not a superficial person. Because sometimes we might notice that the things we criticize in other people may be present in our own heart as well. So before we take it upon ourselves to condemn others or to criticize others, better to do a quick inventory inside to find that I'm not culpable of the same problem, the same defects, the same criticisms that I am throwing out in the world outside. So thank you for all your comments and questions, and keep them coming as we continue to study the Gita together. So next week, we will not have the study of the Gita. Instead, we will have our annual Rama festival. So Rama Navami, the birthday of Sri Rama, according to the lunar calendar, will fall on Wednesday, and we will observe it on Sunday. And as I mentioned in the last week's program update that was sent, we will have the Rama festival over Zoom, and I will send you the link. You'll get the link a day or two before the event for those of you who are on the mailing list. And after the Rama festival, that's on the 25th, the Sunday after that, we will resume our study of the Gita. So that's our program in the next week. We'll conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto you.